All right, everybody, welcome to our continuing interview series. We are back at it after a couple week hiatus, not because we were not busy, but because we were way too busy to keep up with interviews. So we're happy to have this interview series roll on, and we have a very special guest joining us today. He is the former editor in chief of Bitcoin Magazine and the author of The Bitcoin Dollar, an economic monomyth. He is currently an independent journalist and contributor at the Great Unlimited Hangout. Mark Goodwin joins today. Mark, great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Hey,
Hey,
Mark.
thanks for having me. I'm sorry you couldn't get the Hawktua girl. She probably could give you a pretty good overview of the crypto sphere. I think she's probably been more successful than I have in it, but alas, happy to be here.
Well, it was fleeting.
My hawk corn is live.
Yeah, right.
We keep meaning to add that to the soundboard.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into it. We were talking about this is really the perfect time to have you here because we're seeing a lot of people, celebrating the Trump administration and its recent moves as kind of a triumph of populism. And if anyone's familiar with your reporting or Whitney's reporting, in many ways it plays as a fulfillment of everything that you've both been predicting the intelligence services would want, a real privatized government. So let's just start for people, the good thing about not being a crypto person. So I feel like we can ask questions for people who have no idea what they're talking about. Right. So let's start with David Sachs. He had a little conference. I'm sure you checked it out, where he kind of confirmed a lot of what you've been talking about with stable coins. So he wants to introduce legislation, and there's just a little bit of the CNBC article here. Stable coins have been gaining popularity, but mostly overseas. Lawmakers are now promoting US-based stablecoin issuance, reinforcing the dollar's dominance through digital finance. Supporters like Sachs say such a move could drive trillions of dollars in new demand for the dollar and help lower long-term interest rates. That's very much in line with the kinds of things you've been talking about. So now let's go back to the beginning, to Nixon, 1971. He takes the United States off the gold standard. Can you explain that a little bit, what the consequences of that are, how we moved into the petrodollar, and your thesis about now moving to stablecoin?
Yeah, 100%. That press conference was definitely just like I don't generally like to do like victory laps for like evil, terrible shit. It doesn't necessarily feel that good, but that one was kind of one of those like, hello. They either read my book and used it as a cookbook instead of a warning, or we were just really on the ball there. So, but yeah, basically extreme signaling all across the board from the Trump administration that we're kind of moving into this new paradigm of, where everything is signaling in media about de-dollarization and BRICS and all this fears. It's like, actually, nope, the dollar is ripping higher than ever relative to other currencies, as we're seeing these supposed alternatives to, dollar hedge fund, like Bitcoin, also surging to all-time highs, right? More or less. So, so why is that? That seems to be sort of the opposite of what's been like sold to us, right? And that seems to be
I think a lot of people think that Bitcoin is this breaking of the hold of the central banks on the monetary systems, that it's offering this freedom from those systems. And you're really arguing it's being used as a way to prop up at least the American currency.
Yeah, it will actually probably ironically allow more money printing and more debt pardoning at a time where the dollar probably should be dealing with its debt and starting to lose maybe hegemonic status. We're seeing the opposite happening. And that's mainly, being done through these dollar stable coins that are proliferating everywhere. But let's go back to let's roll it back. Go back to the beginning. The world started in the 70s, right? So we'll start in 71. And yeah, the US dollar at that point was, still redeemable for gold, right? You could there were still a lot of issues before that, right? A lot of economists like to get sort of pissy about, well, hey, 1971, well, there was, Charles de Gaulle sending his fleets to the U.S. demanding their gold, well before that, and the London gold pool exploding. And there were a lot of issues with the gold system beforehand, before the Nixon shock in 71, where they officially took us off this peg. But let's bring it back even a little bit further. Why a gold standard at all? Why this sort of a commodity standard? And the general reason is that, value is sort of energy. Money is this communicative tool that basically allows society and tribes to scale beyond just, being this really closed, trusted system of like, a dozen to 3 dozen people that can, kind of successfully, remember in their heads, basically the ledger of who owes what and whatever. Money allows you to kind of scale to much bigger, networks, which is like, that's not a bad thing. Money gets very demonized.
It depersonalizes exchange.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. But it's a technology, right? And it gets demonized a lot because it gets used as a control system and used as a way to divide people and conquer people, rather than, bringing people together in this new, technical forum. So money is fine. It's a technology like anything, like any technology can be used for good, used for bad. The internet is one of the greatest panopticons ever built. Also, we're able to have this conversation and bring out information to everybody, and that's fucking cool. Same with money. So the reason why people settled on, gold and silver, these bimetal standards, or the gold standard, wasn't necessarily because of conductivity of the metal or shiny gold jewelry. The main economic reason was that it takes a lot of energy to get it out of the ground, right? It's hard to source. It's scarce. So nowadays gold is coming out of the ground, around like 3%. Relative to its total supply a year, we're like extracting out of the ground. So there's a limited growth of the monetary supply if you have a limited inflationary commodity that's backing your dollars. So the U.S. government had this issue. They basically kicked everybody's ass, right, in the post-war, and they were really the dominating economy. And they were limited by their growth was actually limited by the amount of gold that they could source, because there wasn't so much gold that they could get out of the ground. Just because they had economic hegemon status doesn't mean they could create more gold. So, the gold standard was a great idea because it, limits political decision being able to inflate the total supply of your money, which, obviously debases the purchasing power of your money. And again, money is sort of this technology that was created because you have two bartering parties, and you want to limit sort of the shitty outcomes that occur between bartering with like items, right? Like if, say there's 2 guys, I've used this analogy before, but one has, an apple, has food, and the other has a bicycle. And the guy with the bicycle is really hungry and he needs food. And the guy that has the apple needs to go somewhere to, get more apples. So they do this trade that makes a lot of sense in that moment. The guy trades the bicycle for an apple and everyone wins in the first 3 minutes, right? It's great. The guy that was hungry now gets to eat, and the guy that needed to go somewhere who had an apple now gets to go. But in 45 minutes, that guy that traded his bike for an apple is sitting there and he has no ability to go anywhere. Yeah, his stomach is full, but he can't go anywhere. And the guy that just traded it, or that just got the bike and traded his apple, has now driven 45 minutes down the road on his fixed gear, and he's fucking hungry and he needs food. And so all of a sudden, just as time occurs, time is a humongous part in any, study of energy. Time is, and therefore money, if we're going to use this analogy that sort of money is an energy, there's a huge variance already just when you add time into this equation that has created these 2 shitty outcomes for both people doing trade. If they had used a financial instrument, a tool, they would be able to still have their items and just have exchanged money and then go find another apple cart, go find a bike store, whatever, and been able to kind of satisfy their needs outside of that like small instance. So money is this thing that allows you to scale, very well from a civilization standpoint. And it's important, and it's a technology. and it's a technology that we should consider, well, we can tweak things about that. We can kind of, like we change all other technologies all the time. Everything evolves. Why can't money be something that evolves too? So money has evolved over time. It's been a whole bunch of different things. It used to be things you could source really easily, like shells on the shore. The problem with that is that
here in New York, there's a place by the Battery where actually
Mm.
the Native Americans used to make wampum from the
Right.
shells. They would harvest the shells there.
Right. And then the problem occurs is then someone finds a hidden beach where all the wampum shells are, and then they can go and then they can start inflating the monetary supply, and they get an extreme economic advantage because they're the first people that get to introduce the new money. And so they get this sort of quintillion effect advantage by being closest to the money printer, in this case, the seashore. Anyways, we're getting a little lost in the analogies here, but that's sort of a little primer of what money is and why money had kind of gone towards these energy commodities, is because it makes the debasement a lot harder. So gold is a lot harder to pull out of the ground. It's a lot, it's a lot more scarce than wampum. So it became a harder money, and over time, harder money, sort of drives out worse money. Then we saw sort of, the world economy globalize. And we saw that happen through the use of gold and silver, and varying, different, world currencies around the gold and silver, and different trading, hegemons and all these things. But for the most part, gold and silver really were, mostly gold, the dominating energy commodity that backed money for centuries. And it made a lot of sense. But the U.S. was looking at their issue of, they're like, well, we're dominating here, but we're limited of our our economic growth is actually limited by our connection to the gold standard. And people are kind of starting to call our bluff a little bit, and they're asking for their gold back. And it's really affecting our ability to make more money and grow our economy and lend. So rather than, trying to, lasso an asteroid from space and mine all the gold from it or whatever, or try to find new pockets of gold, they just decided, hey, we're the dominant hegemon here. We're the kings of the castle here. Let's just completely go off the gold standard, and we'll just use dollars as sort of this market float that pegs between currencies, of other world currencies. And, we'll kind of see how that goes. Obviously, immediately we get hit with high inflation, because no longer are we bound by the scarcity of gold coming out of the ground. It's just literally political decision. It's just decree, which is what fiat currency means. That's what that term is, fiat. I believe it's Latin for like decree. And so we were totally on this political system. And obviously, whenever you have a political system dominating money, it's a very corrupting agent. And so people took advantage of it and started printing a lot of money. And, we saw massive amounts of inflation in the United States because of that. And while that's happening, we're
so you're saying, just to interject, the inflation of the 70s was largely connected to going off the gold standard. That's what caused it.
Absolutely. And there was other things too. There was a lot of defense budget spending from Vietnam and some other things, right? But yeah, for the most part, I mean, you can really look at, okay, we were literally limited by how much money could get hit in, could enter the system due to this gold peg. And if we tried to cheat and do that anyway, people would then call our bluff and use those extra dollars to then extract gold, which is literally what was happening. France did that. Charles de Gaulle sent his fleet, asked for all the gold back. People were starting to do that. So we just severed the tie, made a political decision. It's called the Nixon shock because it was quite a shocking thing to just do to change the world economy.
Well, I would imagine if you're gonna have an explosion of spending and then untether the dollar to anything material, that would probably have a compounding effect.
Sure. Oh yeah, it started to run away, and we saw some really crazy things happen in the 70s and the 80s as a result of the Nixon shock. And before we get into the petrodollar, which I think is the most interesting, we did see Volcker come in, Paul Volcker, who's kind of the goat of interest rate manipulation. And interest rate manipulation is a little complicated, interest rates in general, but the idea of it is basically the higher the interest rate, the more money you get, the more yield you get for buying government debt. Simplest way to put it. Maybe even a simpler way you could say it is the higher the interest rate is, the more interested you are in having your money in that financial system. If they're offering you, let's say what Volcker did, literally brought rates up to double digits, 10%, you're getting a free, basically risk-free government. I mean, the U.S. government lending is about as good as it gets in the world, right? You're basically getting a free 10% risk-free by, buying U.S. debt and then waiting the duration, whatever it is, if it's a short duration, T-bill or these longer 10-year, 30-year bonds, you wait that duration and you get a free 10%. So all of this money comes flooding back into the U.S. system because interest rates go super high. And so we did see that post-COVID, and we'll get into that too. But the highest the rates ever got was during the Volcker era in the 80s, 70s into the 80s. We saw 10%. And so while we should be dealing with all of this heavy inflationary action from going away from the gold standard, we're actually seeing more and more dollar demand than ever, which is sort of counterintuitive. But that's how we basically bribe you to stay in the dollar system by paying you these rates, right? But the fastest rate increase we ever saw was actually after COVID, when we went down to 0%. Jerome Powell comes in and raises rates faster in history than ever to deal with the inflation of the CARES Act and all that, and breaks all the yield curves and all these things. And we'll get into why. I swear to God, this will all make sense, and I will tie it back to Bitcoin. But the important thing before we get into that happened in the 70s, before the Volcker interest rate stuff started to pop up, was the establishment of a new energy commodity. So we broke away from gold. Makes sense. Right. We're limited by the amount of gold we can take out of the ground. Let's break away from it. Let's go to this free peg, and we can just print money and pay off our debts and pay for our defense budget and all these things. But what happened was, we saw some really funny things happen in 73 and 74. There was the Yom Kippur War in 73, and the U.S. gives a bunch of money, to defend Israel. And, we get immediately, there's an oil embargo, and oil prices go up, 400%, go up just an insane amount of money because the U.S. is being embargoed by, these surrounding Middle East countries that don't want us to play with them. Oil's really important because you need it to industrialize, right? There's very few nations actually that are energy independent, and certainly very much even fewer that have a lot of oil that they can actually afford to be, cut off from the oil supply. So Kissinger and crew, go in, and in 74 they sign this, secret deal. It was kind of obvious in some senses, and a lot of people had talked about it before, but I think it actually came to light from a FOIA, actually somewhat recently, like 10 years ago or something like that it was officially, actually, no, this was a signed thing. But basically they go in and they talk to Saudi Arabia and they say, hey, let's establish a new paradigm of money, and let's have you price oil, this energy commodity that everybody needs, highly demanded, price it in dollars. And all you got to do is price it in dollars. And what we'll do is we'll give you military aid, and we'll defend you, and we'll help you pull it out of the ground. We'll give you a bunch of arms, and you become this dominant figure in the Middle East. And all you got to do is anytime anybody wants to buy oil, they got to buy dollars first. So what that does is it creates, this artificial demand for dollars during a period where we have gone off the gold standard. The dollar is inflating, and it should be flying in the sky, sort of this depegged entity. And now we're forcing every industrializing country in Asia and in Europe that wants to buy oil now has to buy dollars first. So we have billions of dollars of demand for dollars. And so we can basically shovel these inflationary effects that should be sort of hitting the dollar system and should be sort of taking away our net purchasing power. Instead, we have buyers. We have buyers for government debt. We have buyers for dollars. So people are buying dollars. The Saudis are taking the dollars, then bringing those dollars back and buying U.S. dollar debt. And Kissinger called this petrodollar recycling, right? And we've created this new paradigm where we've again, it's not a literal monopoly. Of course, there were some ways you could get oil in the world economy that wasn't dollars, but for the most part, It was. Did I cut out here? Oh, there we go. My screen just went black.
No,
Sorry.
you're good.
No.
So there was a de facto monopoly on oil that you had to buy dollars first, and it sort of allowed us to get out from under this. We didn't have to deal with this inflation because we've made this floating peg to this highly demanded energy commodity. And so we saw this, the petrodollar system. It's very evident that, when you look at sort of macro and global political action just in the Middle East over like the ensuing decades, the U.S. just had a huge presence in the Middle East always. They couldn't swing a dead cat without them, invading another country. Or that was I don't know why I said that, but they were just everywhere. They just had huge military presence.
You should have heard Keaton's colonoscopy metaphor yesterday.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Do we dare? Do we dare bring it up? But yeah, I mean, just we're everywhere over there, and we're really establishing and making sure that we're enforcing, this agreement through, political agreement, but really military force. And we're making sure that everybody's buying dollars before they buy oil, and this system works really well for a really long time. And then, we start to see some cracks in the system in the late 2000s. Obviously, we see a little bit of issues beforehand. Nobody likes to talk about it, but in the very, very start, the first week of September in 2001, before the events that happened in the second week, we started to see a bunch of treasury failures in the Federal Reserve System. And then, of course, we see, the actions that happen. And they pass a bunch of emergency actions that allow all of these treasury settlements, treasuries in this case being government debt,
Right.
the coupons that back the dollar, right? You go to your bank, the dollars that are in your checkings account are backed by U.S. treasuries, by government debt. So banks buy treasuries and then they create dollars. Reductive, but pretty much that's what's going on. So we saw that a little bit before 9/11, and then 9/11 happens. We immediately go right back out into the Middle East and start fucking around over there and kind of reinforcing the petrodollar, while of course using those events to create a lot of the consent, basically a populist movement for consent of the Patriot Act and for a lot of these panopticon light systems that we're now really going to see as we move into this sort of the Bitcoin digital asset paradigm. We see that all kind of get built out in the Patriot Act era. A lot of the things we learned about from the Snowden leaks and all that. So that all kind of kicks off really in earnest in 2001. Interestingly, PayPal's the first company to go public after 2001. Probably not that important, but there's this paradigm shift happening where we're really seeing, the fintech and internet space coming out of Silicon Valley, which we just know a lot of these, basically the intelligence community was working. They were going from being these obvious DARPA funded projects, like a Sun Microsystems. The Sun in Sun Microsystems stands for Stanford University Network. The intelligence community was really using these grants, DARPA and the National Science Foundation, in establishing Google, establishing Sun, establishing.
Hang on, we're gonna get there.
Okay.
I want to stick with the.
Yeah, with the monetary stuff.
Bitcoin winds up basically coming in.
Perfect.
And you've made this connection. 2008 is when you see this emergence of Bitcoin, which you don't see as
that's the next beat. That's the next beat for sure. But I think it is important to look at the context of, what's happening in America while, right before this really kicks off. And we will get into the data broker stuff for sure. But anyways, 2001 was also an important beat. And then we see a lot of more military action in the Middle East. Then we get to 2008, really 2007, and we start to see, cracks in the system where these bankers are basically collateralizing our mortgages, trading them around, doing all this speculative bullshit, and all this stuff starts to pop. Again, we see big bailouts. The banks get bailed out, and what do we see? We see the Bush era leaving, this previously populist wave that came in after 9/11 or, during 9/11, and it gets replaced by the hope and change, taking over Occupy Wall Street. Obama kind of comes in as this populist move. And interestingly, the bailouts are split. So the Republicans blame Obama and the Democrats blame Bush, and no one really blames any of the people that actually did anything. And the bankers get billions of dollars. Back then, $500 billion was a ton of money. And the bailouts really weren't that big. They didn't even cross $1 trillion combined. But that was a lot of money back then. And some random person releases, on Halloween 2008, on the cypherpunk mailing list, this idea of, hey, I think I kind of came up with this idea of a government neutral money called Bitcoin, and here's the white paper. And so that comes out in 2008, just very conveniently. And then for the most part, the U.S. economy does okay. Obama era was decently good. There was obviously a lot to deal with the great financial crisis, but eventually we kind of dug ourselves out and, was doing decently okay versus a lot of the rest of the world. And then, obviously let's just flash forward right to Trump era, as he's getting ready to come out. It's kind of the end of the Trump era. We see the COVID crash happen. We see the lockdowns happen. So a lot of people hyper focus on March 2020, which is when a really important beat happened for this paradigm shift of moving away from the petrodollar energy commodity towards what I call the Bitcoin dollar paradigm. And so we have to do a little bit of background on Bitcoin, a little bit as to connecting it to energy. But it is an energy commodity in the sense that you are demanding a ton of computers to, do these hashing algorithms to try to find and mine more Bitcoin. We can get more into the details later, but what that means is basically to be able to mine Bitcoin, you have to have a lot of energy to power these computers. So it ends up being a lot like an energy commodity because it demands a lot of energy, much like gold coming out of the ground or oil. It has this innate connection to energy. So in March 2020, what do we see? We see the government lockdowns happen. Oil futures literally go negative. Now they're futures, right? It's not literally we're paying you $120 to take oil away from us, but that's I'm a 9/11 kid. I was born in 1990. Like my whole paradigm is sort of, oil. Let's make memes about, we found oil. Let's go send F-16s. All of a sudden, the market is saying, we don't want the oil. Gold implodes. Bitcoin, which had been doing pretty well, in 2017, 2018, it hit, around like 20,000. It crashes down to about $3,000. All of this kind of occurs on the same day as the lockdowns are announced. So what happens over the next year? Bitcoin 20x's. Bitcoin then goes up to, almost $70,000.
Right.
And I would say in that moment in March 2020, we formally left the petrodollar system. Very shortly after, we see us run out of Afghanistan. We start to pull out of being sort of an empire that goes places and does military, direct conflict to enforce the petrodollar. And we see this embracement of digital assets, and specifically Bitcoin. Some funny things happened, obviously, before COVID. I think one thing that a lot of people don't really know is that Larry Fink, who now operates the BlackRock iBit iShares ETF, the Bitcoin ETF, which is the fastest growing ETF in history, about 6 to 9 months, it was in fall of 2019, he meets with Donald Trump, he was previously Trump's money manager before he even came into office. And he meets with him and they come up with this plan called the Going Direct plan, which was basically an idea of how to print a whole bunch of money and get it directly to asset managers like BlackRock to the tune of trillions of dollars. So in 2008, it was $500 billion, and that was worthy of protesting outside Wall Street and all the things that happened across the country. This is like, a 16x basically. We're talking $7, $8, $9 trillion. And this plan came to fruition and was drawn up entirely, which they acted upon, 6 to 9 months before there was even a whisper of a virus anywhere. which is very interesting. So the going direct plan was sort of established by Fink. Trump, at the meantime, is tweeting about how Bitcoin sucks and the dollar's king, and doing his classic misdirection rhetoric. Meanwhile, on his last days in office, he brought in, Steve Mnuchin as his Treasury Secretary, an old Goldman guy, and Steve Mnuchin worked at this bank, One West, who profited an insane amount during the 2008 crisis, because all the banks made a ton of money doing this speculative fraud, and then they got bailed out. He was supposed to get charged for doing illicit stuff. The DA of the state that he was in was Kamala Harris, and she declines to prosecute him at all, throws it out. He becomes Secretary Treasurer. He brings in one of his old buddies, Brian Brooks, to run the OCC, which is kind of like the oldest and most important legal money litigator in the United States. And he signs all these laws saying, or bulletins really, but saying that it's okay for banks to hold crypto and specifically stable coins. And he does that all right as he's leaving, as they are walking out the door. So again, in 2008, we saw this split of administrations. We saw all this kind of crazy stuff happen, bailing out the banks. Trump is kind of doing the same thing going into the Biden era. It's important to know that there's just obviously a uniparty thing here. And we're seeing this, it's profits over anything. But Biden obviously is kind of a big part of the COVID story, of the misdirection, him coming in and being this lame duck for 4 years, as we see Trump now surge back with populism. But anyway, we see Bitcoin really start to grow and become sort of this formidable new paradigm. But people are still kind of talking about it being this anti-dollar thing and how it's competing with the US dollar. The ethos of Bitcoin is that it's going to, defang the central bankers and all this. Meanwhile, there's a few of us, very, very small amount of us, but kind of saw the writing on the wall and were like, why would this actually defang the US dollar system if the US dollar system literally needs, now that we're printing trillions of dollars, we've printed, an insane amount of money. We're $36 trillion in debt now. The US dollar system needs a place like the petrodollar appeared as a phoenix, just coming out of nowhere to save us from this depegging of gold. We need an asset, an energy commodity to inflate the dollar into, where we can print a bunch of money, but still create demand for dollars by pricing that energy commodity in dollars. So we see a total recreation of the petrodollar system occur during the time where the U.S. needs it more than ever, which is exactly what we saw in the 1970s. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that Bitcoin popped off in 2008. It just seems very convenient. And here we are. We've established sort of this new paradigm of an energy commodity tied to the U.S. dollar. Of course, the missing piece is, well, how is it tied to the U.S. dollar? And we haven't really talked about that yet. And that's where stable coins come in. And stable coins, all they are those same U.S. treasuries that, the government is selling its debt to banks to create dollars in your bank account. They're selling those same reserve assets to private issuers that are offshore, right? Tether specifically is the biggest one. They're just under $200 billion. They're not technically in the regulatory regime of the United States, but if you're buying $200 billion of reserve assets from the U.S., you kind of are, because they can just pull that from you at any point. You better fall in line, which of course they have. We'll get into that later. But stable coins end up being this, I don't think it's a coincidence that the biggest one is called Tether. It's basically acts as this agent that tethers the dollar to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a lot of things. It's very cool. It's this reserve asset, basically, that you can settle without any trusted third party, which is pretty cool. That's great. That is cool. But it's not really great for everyday payments. It's kind of more of this store of value thing. It certainly evolved to be that way. And a lot of choices were made by influential devs and things to kind of keep it that way. So here we are. It's sort of the store of gold, store of value, digital gold, system, and it needs basically a money market. It needs liquidity underneath it to actually be sort of viable for everyday use. So stable coins step up and they say, hey, we'll be basically your low fee, easy transacting stable. You don't have to deal with all the volatility, 10% days, up and downs. Will just be dollars, and you can go in and out of that. And they basically created a money market for Bitcoin that's backed by U.S. government debt. Very convenient. So now the U.S. basically has this neutral energy commodity that they can print trillions and trillions and trillions, 10 trillions, maybe even 100 trillion. We don't know where we're going here, but the math is the math. And the more and more you print, you have to print more and more to pay off its debt, right? So when in the petrodollar system, it was really enforced by military, right? So our defense spending was far greater than the amount we were spending to service our debt. So when you have a debt, right, you have to pay your service, your interest payments on your debt. So you can actually pay a lot of money into your debt without actually taking away any of the principal, because you're paying, you're servicing the debt, the 5%, whatever it is. So now we're in this paradigm where we're actually spending more money to just service the dollar's debt than we are our military. So it no longer makes sense to be doing the petrodollar system at all. And it makes a lot more sense to have this neutral reserve currency come out of this shadowy figure on the internet that is all priced in dollars. Bitcoin, everybody always talks about it in dollars. Oh, it broke $100,000. It's this basically the new petrodollar paradigm has been created, and it was created very carefully and done in this way to make it seem like, well, hey, Trump can still come out there and say CBDCs suck, but we're pushing stable coins, we're pushing highly surveillable, programmable, and seizable money, all the things we don't like about CBDCs, and we've created a way to pay off our debts by having basically an inflation sink where we can print all of this money, but there's ever and ever and ever more demand for dollars because we're inflating a dollar-denominated currency at the same time. So there's a lot of things to talk about there, and I definitely want to take a break to let you guys talk. But there's one more thing we got to talk about, and one more thing, and then
all right,
I promise.
all right,
I'll drink some water.
All right.
You
hold my fire.
You should start a podcast with Norm Finkelstein.
Maybe I will. One more thing to just say is that there's an important element in Bitcoin itself that is pretty misunderstood, I think. But the monetary policy of Bitcoin has this programmed disinflationary system, where at the very beginning of Bitcoin, when it came out in 2009, it was actually a highly inflationary currency, and there was 50 Bitcoin coming out every block. So it wasn't necessarily this great store of value yet. Even though there was a cap supply at 21 million, it was 50 Bitcoin coming out every 10 minutes.
Right.
But there's a system within Bitcoin, this algorithmic disinflationary sort of asymptotic approach of zero every 4 years about. It gets cut in half.
Right.
And that's very important because it times out really, really nicely with this history that we just sort of described here. And I would say reductive, but I guess now we're 30 minutes in. I don't think it was very reductive. But this history of the U.S. dollar system here, it was inflating at 50 Bitcoin a block. After 4 years, it was in 2012 actually, but at the end of 2012, we see it get cut down to 25 Bitcoin a block.
Right.
And then in 2016, we see it get cut down to 12 and a half. And then right after the COVID that day, that March 2020 day, the next halving was set for Bitcoin to occur around May 2020. And it was a much more important halving than the other ones because the relative issuance, once it got down to 6.15 Bitcoins per block, the relative issuance of Bitcoin was now below 2%, which meant that it was now below the monetary inflation rate set by the Fed and gold coming out of the ground.
Right.
So we're actually seeing this mathematical reason for why you would no longer want to be in treasuries or in gold, and you would want to be into this new paradigm Bitcoin system because it's actually being issued at a slower rate than any of the other monetary systems that exist in the world. So all of a sudden, your Bitcoin is actually a sounder money than gold or the target rate of the US dollar. So you could argue that so many of these things have been set up to knowing that halving was coming and this economic policy was going to change, Trump's giving think $8 trillion, 9 months before Bitcoin is about to hit this halving where it brings it below the issuance of gold coming out of the ground and the dollar inflationary rate. And now we're seeing Bitcoin hit $110,000. Trump is saying how sick Bitcoin is and how dollars are fucking sweet. And stable coins are sweet. And we're seeing these proposals for the U.S. government to hold a Bitcoin reserve. And we're seeing this total 180 shift that's all driven by economic policy. So if you really look at these beats and you look at these numbers, it's not as surprising as you would think that Trump has now pivoted to being pro-Bitcoin, because actually Bitcoin's the only thing that will save the U.S. dollar. So I'll end there. And I'll let you guys ask some questions, and I'll drink some water. But that's sort of, you got to look at all of that to sort of understand how we got here.
That was quite a tour de force. All right, so a couple of questions to clarify.
Yeah,
you seem to be very critical of the idea of money printing. So, what are your thoughts about MMT? Because we get a lot of people who, we get it from both sides. So two questions. One. I have very often had to critique, and maybe it's not really a critique because it almost seems like they're giving up on this idea, is that crypto can't really function as a currency, that it's too volatile. But a lot of people will say, well, actually, Bitcoin is a commodity, so it shouldn't be evaluated in that way. We also very often, when we express skepticism of the core theories of MMT, we're told we don't know what we're talking about. It's not really about money printing. So what are your thoughts? Is Bitcoin a commodity or a currency? And what are your thoughts about MMT?
Yeah, well, certainly where it's developed, or you might even say where it hasn't developed, I would say it's pretty much entrenched in the commodity standpoint right now. And I write about this in my book, about saying that Bitcoin could actually sort of take us out of this dichotomy of currency and commodity and be both. But unfortunately, it looks like people with a lot more power than me that have ability to influence things have sort of pushed Bitcoin firmly into being this digital gold rather than being this peer-to-peer cash system.
Right.
And there's a lot of emotions and a lot of technical and a lot of just financially biased conversation about that. When people go to talk about, why was Bitcoin sort of neutered as a transactional layer in favor of this digital gold element. And I think there's a lot that can still be done to Bitcoin. That's why I'm still sort of in it, is I'm like, no, I think we need to know where it came from and what it can do to enable money printing and debt pardoning and all of these things that are very bad. But it's still a very active game. And I think that's what's still kind of cool about it, potentially. There's a ton of issues. And I think I've been as vocal as anybody about the issues and the shittiness that can come from Bitcoin. But it is still active. And there are still things that we can use with the technology that are very cool. It's very cool that I can settle a transaction and be a dissident and saying fuck the government and all these things and fuck banks and still be able to transfer huge amounts of money around theoretically if I wanted to. That's cool. That's great. That's very powerful, because sanctions are a huge way that governments and nation states enforce, people to stay in line. The way they attacked WikiLeaks, the way they attacked Capone, it was sanctions.
Yes,
really.
But a lot of your reporting suggests that it's being used as a Trojan horse for exactly a kind of surveillance and control that we never even dreamed of. So What are your thoughts about it? But we will get there. What are your thoughts about MMT?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I'm a free market person and a free banking person. And I think that anybody should be able to create an economic system that they want to create. And if you want to create one that has basically an element of inflation by design, you should be able to do that. I don't think that anybody should keep their value stored in a system that perpetuates inflation as a means of there's a lot of talk of, Keynesian schools of sort of like why inflation is good, and it forces people to spend money, and you want debt to be, cheaper, later on. So let's inflate the supply so it's easier to pay off loans. And I sympathize with that, but I think what it actually, like, the outcome of it is that the people closest to the money printer have an extreme levered power over the people using the money. Versus a deflationary system, I think actually it empowers the people that have the money. And that's also a scary paradigm when we are, basically what I just, proposed here is that there was a coordination of the U.S. government and the largest asset manager in the world to seize a bunch of the Bitcoin and hold it, and then print a bunch of money. And so now the U.S. government is one of the largest holders of Bitcoin in the world. The U.S. in general is the largest holder of Bitcoin in the world. This idea that it's this, empowering system and it's spread out across the world and all these things is kind of just really not that true. There's not that many individuals that really own it. So if we enter a deflationary age where Bitcoin is the store of value, it's going to empower the nation state and U.S. empire quite a bit. And that's not good either. So both things are sort of bad, right?
What's your answer to the core proposition that I often hear from proponents of MMT, that a country that prints its own currency can't go bankrupt?
Well, I mean, can't go bankrupt against its own debt, I suppose, right? Whenever their debt comes up to pay the Pied Piper or whatever, they can just print more and pay it. Which is true. But if they're taking out a bunch of loans denominated in dollars, which is pretty much what the IMF and the U.S. empire has established across the world is dollarized, then they absolutely can go bankrupt. I mean, we saw the U.S. go from, in 81, they were the largest creditor in the world. And by 87, they were the largest debtor. And so they've spread out more. They owe more money to anybody in the world, but they can just print more to pay that off. And it's not really a big deal because they have the privilege of being the world reserve currency. But what we saw in the Latin America debt crisis in that era was the runaway debt got so crazy that, Latin America is paying billions of dollars back to the US and not even chipping away at the principal at all. And they have to keep refinancing, and it becomes a system of debt slavery. So I don't think that's cool. I don't think that that's good. The dollarization of the world via debt has bankrupted countries in that sense, right? Or we've seen, hyperinflation and really bad, because who gets hurt in hyperinflation? It's not really the central bankers. I mean, it's the people that are holding currency, trying to sell things for, an insane amount of, pesos or whatever. And then the next day it's completely debased. And I mean, it really hurts working people. And that's where I have a lot of issue with politically controlled money, because the people that always got hurt, they are never the banks. And they are never the politicians, because they can take advantage of their political lever. It's the working class. It's the people that are using the currency to just try to live. And they're the ones that get boned every time. So fuck that. I'd rather not see that continue. I have a lot of issues with Bitcoin, and we need to be very careful about Bitcoin. But it's cool that theoretically over time, because of this deflationary monetary policy and it not being able to be debased by government control at all, it is cool that, a working class guy, I was working in bars. I heard about Bitcoin because the guy that put up Silk Road 2.0 was a regular at my bar, and he came in and explained Bitcoin to me in 2014. I didn't even know it could go up. He just explained it to me as a peer-to-peer cash thing, as was the style of the time. Do kids even watch The Simpsons anymore? I don't know. Yeah.
But I got it.
Thanks. But I was literally just like a bar back at that time. And then I found Bitcoin, and, I was into a bunch of substances and drinking all the time and all this bullshit. And I found this thing that I was like, oh, if I kind of slowly put money into this thing over time, because of monetary policy, I'm probably going to turn out okay. And that actually happened pretty extremely for me in a really cool way. So I love that, but I want to make sure we leave it as permissionless so that can happen for everybody. Because the way it's being posited right now, certainly with stable coins, I think we're just Trojan horsing people into a panopticon grid that's every bit as bad as CBDCs and maybe even worse, being private entities. So
that's a good place, Keaton.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you mentioned, pardon me, speaking of the U.S. empire, a lot of people look at these, some South American leaders like Javier Milei in Argentina, Nayib Bukele. I don't know if that's how you say his name.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, good. Good on me then. In El Salvador has been in the news, obviously, the past few days. And they see these figures as sort of rebels against the global order. But it seems that part of your thesis, tell me if I'm wrong, is that the U.S. sort of destabilized the South American economies in order to pave the way for, exactly these kind of leaders to come about to facilitate the introduction of a digital currency.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty spot on. Yeah. I mean, I thought it was so funny, honestly. At the time, I found this more humorous. Now I'm a little more like, oh Jesus. But that like Malay goes to Davos and
Afuera!
Yeah, is sitting in a room full of like the oligarchs of oligarchs and billionaires and all this shit, and he's just like the free market, and they're all like, yeah, it's like because now we have all the money because we just stole it from you, like let's go.
Didn't he call them the heroes of our time? It was a while ago. I forget exactly what he said,
something
like that. Yeah,
and they loved it, and Klaus Schwab is fucking dapping him up on stage. I mean, it's just a joke. It's like I wrote this piece called Tokenized Ink. With Whitney Webb, and we talked about sort of this idea of, I called it phase shift dialectics, and basically this idea of now that they've basically raided the treasury, the pantry of the world, now they're the biggest champions of free markets that could exist, and we have the Bukeles and the Malays, championing, saying all these things, talking about the Austrian school, talking about deflationary money and all this crap. And it's like, well, okay. But a lot of the things you're saying are correct and are very interesting, and it's populist, right? I mean, they're using the sort of the guise of populism, but what are the actual actions, not the rhetoric? And you look at someone like Malay, and it's like he dollarized the country and sold the lithium to Israel, and has Google and Facebook running the education department. And like, I mean, that's fucking dystopian, man. Is that the free market? Like, I guess, but I mean, that's more like plunder capitalism and sort of, there's a lot of things about it that are very not Argentina first, and are really dollar. I mean, he literally was like looking for outside financing to dollarize Argentina quicker. And I think there's a lot of issues with Argentina right now because of his policies. There's a lot of ways you can look at what he's done that have been very positive. There are a lot of defenders, and then there's a lot of critique that I think is pretty spot on too. And then you look at a Bukele, El Salvador obviously has a big role in the Bitcoin play because they were the first country to legalize Bitcoin, basically make it legal tender, which they have since in the last week rescinded, which is very interesting, to get $1 billion from the IMF. Interesting. But you start to look at, like, we know what the U.S. government and the CIA has done to South America and Central America. I don't know why I'm laughing, but I mean, they've done coups and color revolutions and installed dictators and done banana republic bullshit. And I mean, we have dominated. And again, I say we, but the U.S. government has dominated, the global South and South America and Central America for years using dollars and sanctions, and they've done a ton of sketchy things. They've backed a lot of like military leaders like Pinochet, and then brought in all the Chicago boys, and they've used basically South America and Central America as sort of the economic test bed. And I don't think it's really surprising that like the main focus of where a lot of these fintech companies that are coming out of the US, where they're all focusing, is South America and Brazil and Argentina, and because these are people that have a lot of currency issues in their country, who the people could benefit a lot from having US dollar access. And so it's being sold to us as this altruistic, we're banking the unbanked and we're helping, the citizens of Argentina get out from under, the ridiculousness of their monetary situation. All of that is kind of true. But again, we're shepherding them into these rails, specifically with Tether. They have the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service. There's a company called Chain Analysis, which was funded by InQtel, which is the CIA's venture firm.
Okay, so that's actually a perfect place
Okay.
for my next question. I want to set up this big picture, which I think you'll be able to break this down pretty well. All right. What you get a lot right now, which just makes your head explode very often, is this idea that unaccountable oligarchs breaking into government systems and databases is somehow a vox populi moment.
Right.
So, you have people literally celebrating Elon Musk having everyone's social security number. So in your reporting, and I think ignorance of a lot of what you and what Whitney talk about is necessary for anyone to think that that's a challenge to the deep state rather than a fulfillment of something they've been working towards for decades. So you've done a lot of reporting on InQtel, Zappo, Endeavor, which you describe as kind of the private world version of the young global leaders, what they do with that. Endeavor does in the private sector. InQtel is basically a CIA venture capital firm. They realized they had to get into that space. And you've also talked a lot about how the intelligence services realized a long time ago, well, there are things we can't do as a government entity that we can subcontract out, and Palantir, I think, is a great example of that. So can you break that down for people? Because I think a lot of people don't understand what is actually going on with Elon Musk getting into the treasury system, a guy who wants to create an American version of WeChat. I think most Americans don't even know what that is. They don't even know how that functions. They don't even understand what his goals with X are. Bringing U.S. aid under the State Department, not being an elimination, but a consolidation of the functions of U.S. aid that people complain about. So can you get into that history of where the intelligence services got into the private sector in a big way as an end run around the legal strictures on what they did, and how in many ways, and maybe you disagree with this, I'd be surprised if you did, the Trump administration is a fulfillment of everything they've been trying to do for decades.
Yeah, well, incoming hour and a half rant here. No, I'm just kidding. I won't do that to you again. I think I've done enough damage today on that. Well, it's an extremely complicated.
No, hey man, it's a complicated topic. You can't cover that in 5 minutes.
No.
Hey, Russell asked you to go back to 1971. So
yeah, I did.
That's true.
Hey,
he's lucky I didn't go back.
And hey, man, you did a very effective job. I think you made it very clear.
You should sell that as a traveling lecture. You can get paid a lot of money to just give that answer.
True.
I can send you a tape. Maybe we can work out a revenue share or something.
Dude, let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I really should go back to 1790 at the when Alexander Hamilton started the BNY Mellon, now Bank of New York, which is one of the biggest stablecoin players. Anyway, they hold all the T-bills. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, where were we? Intelligence.
Elon,
intelligence,
InQtel, Zappo,
going into
and the what you call the PayPal mafia. I think a lot of people don't understand how connected to the deep state that people think was overthrown in this election. All the key players are Scott Bessent, Soros alumni. I mean, all of them.
Well, Scott Bessent specifically is very interesting, and then I'll get into this other stuff. It's like if you told. If the left were still in charge and they installed a 30-year Soros lieutenant who's a gay man married with adopted kids to run the treasury. Do you think the right would fucking let that go? They would be talking
Lose
about
their
that
minds.
every day.
Yep.
Like they would be going
Yep.
insane. And so
Yep.
the faux dissonant right, I think, is one of the most, it's just disgusting what the MAGA movement has done to them. It's like, you guys literally just don't stand for anything.
They're clowns. They're clowns. They think transgender kindergarten teachers are the deep state. I mean, that's just about as deep as their analysis goes. Yeah. Clowns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, dude, aren't we libertarians? Like, who gives a shit? Like, obviously there's nuances to all these things, but like, what are we doing? That's not important. And I have a lot of right friends, and obviously, you know, I was in the Bay Area during COVID, and you know, watching the left completely implode and become a fascist state also was disturbing too. I'm not letting them off the hook, but everyone is on their ass anyway. So it's right. Exactly. Well, that's why I'm here. I don't do a lot of pods. But yeah, it's kind of a shit show right now of discourse. But anyways, here we are. So obviously my co-patriot here, Whitney Webb, has kind of literally written the book or two on this, One Nation Under Blackmail, which is sort of establishes really establishes, it's a hell of a dense read. Obviously, I highly recommend it. You know, bring a highlighter. There's so much in there. But I think really she did an incredibly good job in every way. But really, I think the most importantly good thing that she did was where she started and the establishment of why this merger happened of the intelligence community, the mob, and the military. And so the book starts off with Operation Underworld, which basically was this idea of, you know, during World War II, they had the U.S. government and the military and the intelligence community had an issue, and they needed to have more information on what was going on at the ports.
Right.
Were there U-boats? Were there people out there? Who were people coming in and out of the country? You know, what was sort of going on? And you know, they sat down and they basically were like, how do we get this information about, you know, what's going on at the ports? And some whiz kid had a great idea, and they were like, well, you know, who knows everything that's fucking going on at the ports? It's the fucking bootleggers and the mob. They know everything about who's there, where the boats are, because there's this whole financial element to it, that, you know, their business and their control systems are entirely predicated on them having an asymmetric informational advantage of what the fuck is going on. You know, that's how mobs stay in power. That's why they implement blackmail and control people and get, you know, source information. You know, it's all about information is power. Absolutely. And so the book starts off with this concept of Operation Underworld of like, hey, we got to go, let's go talk to the fucking, the boys strutting the docks who know more about what's going on in the waters than the U.S. intelligence community at that standpoint. Right. So that establishment, I mean, that's incredibly well documented. You know, and it was a former
they made a deal with Luciano, who was in jail at that time.
Exactly.
You know, it's so amazing. I mean, I don't mean to throw you off, but it's just so amazing that, like, earlier this morning, just popped into my head for absolutely zero reason. The scene in The Departed, where Jack Nicholson and the guys, they meet the Chinese guys down on the docks to exchange. I forget what it was, some technological thing.
Yeah, and microprocesses.
The microprocesses, right? And the feds were trying to surveil them, and they were one step ahead of them. And then Alec Baldwin was like, "You fucked this whole thing up." And it's just amazing that very thing came up just now.
Yeah.
How do you like
well,
that?
because I mean, it's a tale as old as time. It's just there's always these conflicting factions, and the asymmetric informational advantage is what wins you money, which wins you power, and vice versa. And it's this triangulation that goes on forever, and everything's a fractal. And here we are. But Operation Underworld, back to reality, was sort of the kickoff of the merger of the mafia and the intelligence community, and it was because of information. And information to be used for military purposes, just clearly. And so that relationship didn't just die on the vine after they figured out if there was or wasn't someone in the ports. You know, obviously it was portrayed, you know, for a really long time. This relationship grew, and they realized that the mob was like, well, we have a lot of interest in getting connected. You know, there's a lot for us to be giving you information so we can get away with a bunch of shit. And then also there was a lot of advantage for the government and the intelligence communities to be connected into these, at the time, underworld, groupings and power structures that occurred under the nose of the U.S. government. So the merger and the partnership made a lot of sense. And so we saw that. And in the military, the blossomings of sort of the military data broker era, a lot of it was done, through academia. That was really like the best way to basically indoctrinate, not through necessarily, kind of the Roy Cohn, Epstein model of sort of sexual blackmail, but kind of like you get a kid, you give them an incredible opportunity through education, and then you teach them what you want to teach them, and you give them all of these opportunities to grow into these sort of, you mentioned Endeavor and YPO and the WEF Young Leaders thing, and you kind of give them these like stepping stones of places to sort of grow into. You can kind of own people. That sounds a little dark, but it's kind of true. You can sort of dictate the path of where they're going, and there's a huge advantage to having agents abound. And the best way that the intelligence community basically saw that they could sort of build a fleet of people to basically come in and install the things that they wanted to see in the ensuing generations was through academia. And I think, I just did a piece on this, and I have another piece coming out that is sort of, that was the stepping stone to the next piece. That's it's kind of disturbing, honestly. But the first piece, this evolution of data brokers, militarized data brokers, was sort of looking at, how did the internet come about and why? And where did DARPA come from? And where did all these groups that were basically giving all the funding to these students, once you establish sort of intelligence strongholds in, a Yale and a Harvard and a Stanford, well, how do you get them money and how do you get them to build the products that you want them to build for national security reasons? And so DARPA itself, which is sort of the king of all this shit, was literally directly done as a reaction to the launching of Sputnik. So Sputnik was, the first artificial satellite in space, basically a fucking soccer ball with 4 antennas on it. But it had broadcasting capability, and it sort of triggered the creation of DARPA as a reaction to like, oh shit, they are about to have an asymmetric informational advantage if we allowed them to conquer space and satellites. And so they created DARPA as this way to, basically win the space race. But obviously DARPA had a lot of other things. There was a lot of other ways to win the information war. And one of the main ones was kind of creating the mycelium structure of modern communications. And so obviously they did a lot of work on radios and GPSs and satellites and drones. And, DARPA was really all over this place at the very beginning. But the main thing that is really kind of important and certainly ties into the Bitcoin Internet of Money story is they created the internet. Reductive, but true.
It was
called... Well, hey, maybe he was involved. I thought it was Sega. No, but anyways, they created the ARPANET. So DARPA, ARPA, they kind of changed names a little bit, but Advanced Research Project Agency. Defense was in there at some point. Now housed in the Pentagon. But they created ARPANET, which was sort of this idea of, well, hey, if we're going to create an information system, a network that can be useful in war, we have to create a system that can sustain loss of control systems. So if we have a centralized point of failure, right? So back in the day, this is kind of important actually. Back in the day, when you wanted to make a call to someone, it was a direct line-to-line analog connection.
Right.
So there'd be a fucker, listening to the radio, sitting and would be plugging in the switchboard operator would literally be connecting the phone in your hand to the phone in someone else's hand. It was a physical connection. And so they had to create a system where if, because there's a lot of failure in that. If someone just bombs the main switch operator in the center, then the whole information network that you just built is down. which obviously has huge implications for, Cold War era, nuclear Red Scare, whatever was going on there. There was a lot of fear there. So, hey, how do we build an information system that will give us this asymmetric informational advantage and can sustain acts of war? So what they had to do was create an information distribution network that, rather than creating a direct one-to-one analog system, they broke the stream of information into little packets, little blocks of information, and then they would all get sent through various connections and then be reassembled as they reached its point. So that was basically what the internet was. It was this idea of getting away from the analog one-to-one connection and then really compartmentalizing data, turning it into these little packets and being able to have it be spread and then, rejoined at its landing spot. So the internet came out of ARPANET, out of DARPA directly from a military standpoint. But then, of course, once they built it, they saw, well, oh my God, well, there's so much things that this can be used for. How do we build commercial applications? How do we build network infrastructure? How do we make this like a viable, usable thing beyond just the CIA and the FBI sending cat memes back and forth to each other in DC? How do we do that? And so they had to get the best and the brightest to build these things. How do you do it in a way that doesn't obviously signal to everybody else in the world, like the Sputnik, the space race? We saw that happen. It was publicized. It was, oh shit, that triggered us to go build all of this stuff. How do we make sure that doesn't happen? Well, let's do it in fucking secret. Let's do it quietly. So in the 70s, as this sort of the internet is, private computers, personal computers are starting to like become a thing into the 80s, DARPA is literally, through the National Science Foundation, is distributing grants through this project. It was MDDS. That was this data distribution system, mass data distribution systems program. And so the CIA, DARPA, and the NSA were literally distributing money, mainly to San Jose era area places, mostly Stanford at the time in the 90s. And they were giving all of these grants to, young grad students to basically build the data broker systems. We want to have the internet be the library of the future. How do we build querying and indexing and all of this stuff? Let's give grants to people and give them computers, and then they can build the software for us. Mm-hmm. And then we want to commercialize it because it has commercial opportunity. So then we'll have you just take we funded you. The CIA and the NSA is funding Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Stanford. And then we'll give you the computers. You'll build all the system. Then when you want to go incorporate it, we'll have Andy Bechtolsheim, who's the founder of Sun Microsystems, which started as a DARPA project. And we'll have him cut you $100,000 check. So you incorporate the company and you take all of the stuff you learned from CIA and NSA DARPA grants, and then you incorporate Google. And now you've actually completely washed your hands of any sort of direct government funding. And then you create one of the largest, most important companies in the United States history. That is, one of definitely the top 7 stocks. The Alphabet stock is one of the most important market cap. I mean, it is the American economy in a lot of ways. And you're also creating this unbelievable asymmetric information advantage that, because you're a private company, you're now sort of out of the constitutional restrictions of, can we, seize customer data? Can we give it and sell it to private people, to other private entities? Are we able to restrict customer access or deplatform people? Right? Like a lot of these things, if they were done just directly in the public sector, they wouldn't be able to do those things. There would be constitutional protections. If a CBDC actually was to exist, they couldn't say you can't use a CBDC. Then it would break, so many of the, so many issues of, okay, if we're going to create a government currency, it needs to be available to all, and all the things that, that ensue with that. But if you do it in the private sector, you can kind of get away with more customer restriction. So DARPA, CIA, NSA, National Science Foundation is putting all of this money into academia, and then all of these companies are coming out. Sun Microsystems was basically the foil to Microsoft. Microsoft went personal computers, and Sun Microsystems went network infrastructure. and they built all the broadband, all the network switching, all the Ethernet stuff.
Isn't that, am I remembering right? I covered this the other day. Isn't that one of the companies that just got access to the Treasury's payment systems with Elon Musk going in?
I didn't hear that, but that would be insane. And I'd love to check that out because it would solidify a lot of things that I'm working on right now. But I actually didn't see that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
There was definitely another company in my coverage. I could swear it was that. I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't be that surprised. I mean, literally, they started as a DARPA cutout. They got funding. They were a project from DARPA, much like Larry Ellison's Oracle was a Project Oracle that was under the CIA. And, then they incorporated, became a private company, Oracle. Their first company is the CIA. As this sort of .com San Jose project stuff is popping off, PayPal also pops off. And PayPal was really interesting, because Max Levchin did this sort of infamous interview with Charlie Rose. Again, I mentioned they were the first company to go public after 9/11. So he was talking a lot about, the terrorist attacks or whatever. And he says, hey, when I built PayPal, I worked with every single 4- and 3-letter agency in existence, and they were the most fruitful business relationships that I ever had. And he's defending the NSA. He said he applied to the NSA, but he wasn't yet a citizen. And when he went to the NSA, the guy there told him, if you join the NSA and you want to use cryptography to help the nation, just know that you'll never make a dime. You'll get paid a fucking, clerk's wage, and you'll never be able to patent anything or make any money off of it. So he goes and applies to the NSA after graduating from the University of Illinois in computer sciences, where he spent his entire time working on distributed systems and cryptography. And he goes to apply to the NSA, and they say, you'll never make a dime. And then he gets sent and moves to Palo Alto and ends up getting connected, moves into Scott Bannister's apartment, who was a VP at this incubator, Idea Labs, who became the first investor of PayPal, and Scott Bannister became the first board member. And Scott said, hey, you should go to Stanford and go watch Peter Thiel, who's this currency trader, do a lecture on currency trading. And he goes and meets Peter Thiel. The next day they have lunch and they form PayPal. And PayPal obviously was working with a ton of intelligence agencies, and developing, at the time, their first motto was a new world currency. And their whole idea was developing a new world currency. Interestingly,
now.
What's that?
Bad branding these days.
Yeah. Well, I think they learned pretty quickly not to do that. David Sachs, who was their chief operating officer at the start of the company, he came in. He was one of the first employees, who's now Trump's crypto and AI czar, which is interesting, don't you think? But anyways, and we should talk about the AI crypto combination. But PayPal gets formulated. And, one of the main issues when you're making digital cash is there's all this fraud, right? A lot of people are, that's really the main issue why digital cash hadn't popped off yet, was because, it's very easy to manipulate. Anything online was certainly back then, there wasn't a lot of fraud mitigation techniques. So Levchin spends all this time building things like the first commercial application of CAPTCHA and a lot of these things to sort of stop online fraud. And he develops this really powerful fraud algorithm that they lovingly name Igor, after this Russian guy that was the serial fraudster that would keep antagonizing them and forcing them to build up their systems. And they actually end up taking that Igor algorithm, and Thiel spins it off from PayPal, which is already, was a private sector company, and then forms Palantir with Alex Karp based on that algorithm, which is advised by John Poindexter, who was working at the CIA working on this group, Total Information Awareness, TIA. And basically they were getting shit being a public company, a public sector idea of building this panopticon of data on everybody. And so Poindexter goes, hey, you should take that fraud algorithm and let's privatize TIA and let's create Palantir. And the first company and all the first money and everything coming in, we'll fund it with InQtel. And all of your first customers can be the CIA, and we'll basically privatize the CIA and push it into this using this algorithm you guys built to create a new world currency. And now Palantir obviously, there's an intern of Palantir that's now running the treasury, rewriting the software in the treasury using AI, who's never taken a constitutional oath or any of these things. We're just so full into Elon. Obviously started, his first real break. He had sold the company first, but X.com initially was merged with PayPal. And these guys, this PayPal mafia group, they were the guys that started YouTube. They started LinkedIn. They started Yelp, Affirm. Like so many of these just groups all came out of this nexus of people that were heavily connected to Stanford, which we knew was a group that was taking a bunch of money from the CIA and the NSA and DARPA. And then they started creating all of these private sector companies. And that's not even to mention Thiel's involvement with Facebook, which we all know was sort of this privatization of LifeLog, which was a DARPA project of how do we create a system of everybody's face, everybody's information, their date of birth, all of this stuff. What's incentivized them to give it to us? And they basically created Facebook. It launched the same day LifeLog was shuttered, very similar to TIA and Palantir. And Thiel happens to be the first investor. And, a lot of these things that started as ideas at DARPA and in the government moved into the private sector because they were actually much more protected there, and they had commercial applications and could end up making the U.S. government billions and billions and billions of dollars in taxes by being these trillion-dollar companies.
You've also suggested, usually we look at the revolving door between government and the private sector as being all a grift, right? You build up your resume in the public sector and then you cash in the private sector. You've actually presented that the purpose of that, or I've seen you speak about it in this way, that the purpose of that is actually that these things are working together. So you kind of need these personnel to go back and forth from Amazon and into the government because they're all have the same intelligence services aims. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, I mean, well, Amazon is a good point to bring up too, is because Bezos is the grandson of the founder of DARPA, and so it's like, well, who do they pick these guys?
I did not know that.
Yeah, well, no one knows this shit. No one talks about this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's like, well, how do you pick a guy to be the front of Amazon? Amazon has a huge, national security presence in the United States. I mean, it's critically important to the U.S. Those FANG stocks. Well, I guess it's Mang now or what, I don't know. Facebook is Meta or whatever. Mang. But those stocks that are basically the US government, we're not an industrial nation. We don't fucking build anything. We're a software nation, basically. And so like, who gets to run these software companies? There's like heavily compromised and or nepotism people that get to create these companies and run them. And for an example, you could look at the founder of Tether, Brock Pierce. He was a Disney actor as a child who gets wrapped up into the digital entertainment network with Mark Collins Rector and Chad Shackley.
All right, so I know where you're going. We prefer fan of the playground. We go with that one.
Okay, fan of the playground. We'll call it that. But again, a really potentially compromised individual who had legal action and was arrested with a bunch of playground manuals and a bunch of things in Spain, and the partner that he founded Digital Entertainment Network with went to jail for playgrounds. And, he ends up getting sucked into, so he gets really depressed after that happens, right? He gets very depressed and he starts gaming a lot, and he starts playing World of Warcraft a lot. And he starts this company, Internet Gaming Exchange, IGE. And he starts the first ever digital, goods store, basically. And he starts selling World of Warcraft gold and items and all of these things. He starts this business, which then promptly gets bought out by Goldman Sachs, and Steve Bannon replaces him as the CEO of the company. And then he gets into Bitcoin through, World of Warcraft basically found out that Goldman Sachs is running this like $1 billion company that's like taking over Korea and doing all of this insane money laundering, basically using World of Warcraft gold. And Blizzard nukes their gold accounts and locates where they have all these troves of gold and deletes them from the server, and they get debased, and all of this money gets taken away from them. And they're like, this sucks. And so then they end up randomly just getting into Bitcoin evangelism, right at that same time. While doing IGE, Pierce ends up working with William Quigley and Jim Armstrong and these guys that worked at Idea Labs, which again was that incubator that PayPal was, that came out of. Interestingly, Bill Elkis, who was the co-founder of Idea Labs, was a trustee of the Jeffrey Epstein estate. But anyways, that's not that important. Anyways, and Brock Pierce starts Tether, and he starts the first ever stable coin after having running a fund. He ran a fund called Clearstone Gaming, which was out of the Idea Labs group. So the same people that gave PayPal their money to start alongside Goldman, he has these Goldman connections. He starts this fund with all of those guys to start basically the dialectic to begin the introduction of digital goods, right? And that's, you also look at the paradigm of what Facebook really was. It was really the dialectic creation of the first digital ID. It was really the first creation of getting used to having digital ID. Obviously, Google played a big role in that as well. You sign into every website with Facebook or Google or whatever. But so Brock Pierce, this guy kind of coming out of this, really kind of shady introduction, ends up becoming the guy that creates Tether, which now we know is sort of like they're buying treasuries at a bigger rate than any other country in the world. They hold like
more than China.
Well, China holds like 800 billion, something like that. Tether holds just under 200 billion. So it's like we're getting to the point where this private company that has like 45 employees has as much US government debt as fucking China or Japan, or like a fourth or a sixth or wherever, obviously they buy and sell, so it fluctuates a little bit. But they're the fastest net buyer of treasuries over the last 18 to 24 months by far. And I think where we're going, we saw that David Sachs, again, the COO of PayPal, now the crypto czar, saying we see the stablecoin market cap going into the trillions. Well, what does that mean? That means trillions of dollars of debt being sold to these private issuers. So what does that mean? Well, that means Bitcoin is going up like crazy, because the main thing you do, to use stable coins for is to buy and trade Bitcoin, but also that the US government is going to print trillions of dollars of treasuries to sell to these people, right? I mean, these things can't happen in a vacuum. The stablecoin market can't go up to trillions of dollars of highly regulated stablecoins without that money then going somewhere else, and then also the reserves being made to back the trillions of dollars coming in. So we're seeing this paradigm of creating this whole system. Again, we're talking the formation of DARPA from Sputnik to the Nixon shock to, all of this stuff is kind of culminating with this phase shift dialectic of let's champion the free market, and Bitcoin's so cool and based, and stable coins are sick, and we're banking the unbanked and the global South, and it's so cool. But like we're leading towards this consolidation of the world economy onto these rails that were built by DARPA, the internet, and all these things, to these data systems, these data brokers, these ID systems, all built by agents and players that are heavily connected to the intelligence community, all coalescing and consolidating to the point where now we have Palantir interns at DOGE installing software at the Treasury and screening all of that information. And this is one more, I'll finish the rant here. I think the Sachs thing is very interesting, that he's the crypto and AI czar, because the way crypto and Bitcoin work is they're public blockchains. All of your transactional data is published. Oh, did my camera go out?
Yeah, camera went out. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, it's so hot in here. I'm talking too much. I'll keep talking while I fix this. All of the data for your transactions are published on public blockchains, which is, that's cool, right? Because I know I have a Bitcoin node over here. I have every single Bitcoin transaction that's ever been made on a little hard drive over here, right? That's pretty sweet. Except I don't have nation state level caches of data to do any sort of meaningful heuristic triangulation of knowing who actually spent those things or who these wallets are owned by or anything like that. But when you combine public blockchains, which they're public, you don't need warrants for them to surveil any of this stuff. When you combine them with, say, a Palantir-esque grip of data caches, and then you're meeting them with AI, giant, caches of GPUs that can actually process all of this information. Now all of a sudden you've created a warrantless surveillance system that is sort of parading around as this this amazing altruistic good, but I can't meaningfully do anything with all of that information in those public blockchains because I don't have IP address caches. I don't have banking information. I don't have all the information that we've willingly given all of these companies by publishing on DARPA social networks and stuff for the last 20 years. I don't have all that information, so I can't do jack shit with it. But you have a group like Palantir or any of these AI groups, they can do a ton of damage with these public blockchains and their AI server farms. And they've created an asymmetric informational advantage, which is the name of the game here. And they control chip manufacturing. They control NVIDIA. They control where all of these things go. Yes, it's very exciting that Bitcoin is decentralized. No, it's really distributed. And where is its consensus distributed? It's amongst ISPs. It's amongst the chips. It's amongst the energy manufacturers. And all of those things are controlled by the state in many, many, many ways. So you've actually created this beautiful dialectic of this anti-state movement that actually has consolidated power more than any sort of public CBDC could have possibly done. It's disturbing and brilliant, and it's very much still alive, right? It's still a running game. So it's very interesting to see how this will grow and develop. But I think that there's an extreme amount of history to be very, very concerned about here as we see the private sector return, and the chickens are back to roost in Pennsylvania Avenue, and we have their literal interns running around with all of our information that haven't taken constitutional oaths. So that's where we are as of 3:00 on a Wednesday. So
I think I think the brilliance of it is that by delegating it to the private sector and to the market, they're able to cloak it in voluntarism, right?
Yep.
So it feels less totalitarian to the average person because, hey, we're enjoying this. We are submitting ourselves to it, right?
Oh yeah, 100%. And it's
I think especially sorry to cut you off, but I think especially people on the right don't really understand that the private sector can be just as oppressive a force as the government.
Well, we've been taught, it's like central bank bad, private bank good. It's like, fuck JP Morgan, fuck Jamie Dimon, fuck Larry Fink. These are the guys that actually wrote all this policy and advised the public sector to do all these things. Let's bail out, Mnuchin's old bank and then not prosecute him and then let him run the treasury. It's like this we've been really taught that it's been really bashed over our heads, and COVID was a great example of this, of just all of the pressure went towards government bad. It's like, well, what about all the private companies that Amazon made more money than anybody during COVID. BlackRock made more money than anybody during COVID.
There was as much a corporate power grab as anything else, right? Exactly. Yeah.
Well, consolidation. So this is a question that you'll get sometimes when you lay all this out.
Yeah.
Well, if ultimately what the Trump administration is doing is a fulfillment of this deep state collaboration with the private sector, then why are they finding 60% of FBI agents were working on January 6th? It seems
Right.
like at least some part of the deep state didn't want Trump to come into power. Why wouldn't they? So what's going on? Is this Cowboys versus Yankees? Is this different wings of the deep state? Is this entrenched bureaucrats with a different agenda fighting other bureaucrats? What's going on there?
Well, this might get a little hippy dippy, but I really think the elites sort of operate under this idea of karmic law, I think. And I think that they really need our consent to do a lot of the things that they do. Not to get too like David Icke in here, but I think that that's kind of true. And I think I've just learned a lot of, I've seen that a lot, like with COVID pharmaceuticals and things. You had to sign off. You had to do this. You have to vote. But we know it doesn't fucking matter. It's a uni-party thing. So I think that they do a lot of little, like freeing Ross, right? Like Trump freed Ross. That's so sick. That's awesome that he did that. Like Lynn is an amazing mom. And it's so great that, that was this libertarian party basically, did this,
right.
Negotiation to get it. And wow, he's a man of his word and all this stuff. And, so many people literally voted kind of a single issue like for that. And what they've really done is they bought your consent for what they're really doing by giving you this little nugget of something.
Right.
So yeah, they freed Ross, but now they have fucking, little interns running the treasury and doing a whole who God knows what, and building this AI crypto panopticon that will put us all in jail. It's so I think that there's an element of karmic absolution by kind of giving us these wins and making us buy in and give them basically karmic consent to do what they're doing. I also think there's Warren factions. Absolutely. I think there is some cowboy Yankees to some degree. Because there's sort of the gray leader at the top, there's still the black and white, uni-party leaders. And then there, many times, I'm sure there's good faith people that are working in these left and right paradigms that think they're doing the right thing, but they're really being kind of manipulated into their thought rooms and into their pens, and so I think often when you have such an extreme dialectic phase shift, 180 as we've seen, I think that you'll have to see some, there will be kind of carnage and collateral damage from that shift of people that were bureaucratically entrenched in the previous system. But I also really, again, I think it's just consolidation. It's like, January 6th was very weird, but was most likely a psyop to sort of identify, potentially violent, usurping dissonance, and how do we identify them? And now that we've identified them, we don't really need all the people working on it. And now that we have AI systems and all of these things in place, and we have Lutnick running the Commerce Secretary, who is an investor in Tether and holds all of their T-bills, and is bought in a bunch of AI things, and we have Sachs doing his AI stuff, and we've sort of set the precedent for DOGE to be this like, let's get efficiency, let's make everything private and smaller. Like we're just going to see more and more consolidation. Smaller government from a numerical standpoint doesn't mean smaller government. Having 5,000 less FBI agents sounds like a hell of a win, except now you're installing Palantir to fucking run. Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, it doesn't mean that their power
going back to the Pinkertons.
Exactly. It just
digital
means
Pinkertons.
That's basically where we're at. Yeah.
I mean, I think by the time you get to January 6th, you're already at the midpoint of this new Trump era. I think, a more urgent question is, why did they go after him as hard as they did in his first term with the Russiagating and all that stuff? Because the way I explain the January 6th obsession, from my point of view at least, is, it's the old saying, if you take a shot at the king, you can't miss, right? And so, because they had already gone at Trump so hard, they kind of had to take him out of the running for 2024, because I think they were afraid that if he gets back in, he's going to take revenge on those of us who were here who went after him, and that's exactly what he did. Right? Like, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, or just the dialectic of how do we create a populist president? how do we create this consent for this is a guy of the people when the measure of what
Well,
is a
that seems
dissonant,
like what this is all about, right?
yeah,
Like
I lean
you're
more
getting
that way.
all of these MAGA people to agree to
Yeah.
turn over their privacy, to turn over their personal information to the private sector in a way that they would have gone bananas.
Well, exactly. And that's why I
Justified.
say that the real question is what was their problem with Trump to begin with? Because none
Right.
of what you're talking about, Mark, started in 2021. You know,
Right.
it all goes back decades.
Right, exactly. Well, it's like, well, how do we create the perfect environment, the enabling, Ian Davis, this amazing UK-based independent journalist who's done a lot of work on Unlimited Hangout, has sort of this idea that like government is the enabling environment. And so government is just sort of used, to basically be the enabling environment for whatever the elites, want. And I think, they basically used Trump, I think, entirely. I mean, Trump 2.0 could never have happened if he didn't lose exactly in the way that he did. And by losing in the way that he did, and by getting scot-free for some reason off of his COVID policies and all of it being blamed on Biden, he can come in and immediately start giving 500 or, talking about Sam Altman and Larry Ellison doing warp speed 2.0 with mRNA cancer vaccines or whatever, and no one getting upset about it. But anyways, he had to lose exactly in that way, because how else do you get biometric IDs for U.S. citizens? Well, we got it. The stop the steal, man. We got it. We got robbed, and so we have to make sure it's biometric secure voting next time. And we're going to make sure that that never happens again. And oh man, the border is really this crisis here, and so we need to militarize the border and give CIA contractor Palantir spinoff Endurial all this money to make all these drones at the border. And so again, it's always these like dialectic pushes of like Trump is so popular and he has such a mandate and he's funny. There are things I definitely like think about him that I think are funny. But what he's actually doing in the rhetoric of where we're going, I don't think we could have what we're seeing now, Elon coming in and doing all what he was doing, if there wasn't this basically mainstreaming of QAnon of the like, this is 5G chess, bro. And he's coming in here and, he is fixing the deep state and all this stuff. But meanwhile, what actually happens, the first person that visits, the White House is Netanyahu. And now he's going to go make condos in Gaza or whatever. And people are cheering it on. I don't know. It's
well, this is why I say they're clowns. I mean, they're just just clowns, and they are such clowns that they ended up validating a lot of liberal class critiques of them the first time around, which is that you really
in the end, just admit it was all about the pronouns.
Right. Just admit it was all about culture war. It was all, it would, I mean, it was all cultural grievance. Because that's the only really thing you have to hang on to at this point.
Yep.
I guess I
unfortunately. Yeah, it's so hot down here. We're spitting too much fire. My camera keeps going out. I'm gonna change.
That's all right. We're almost done. We got one more question, I think, right, Russ?
Yeah, and then hopefully something from the audience.
Yeah, we got one from the audience.
Screw people. All right, so Marco Rubio kind of hit a different note about de-dollarization this week, and everyone was very surprised to hear this from little Marco. So I'd like to get your comment on this.
Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
So that sounds like the opposite of what you're saying. You're saying we're going to prop up the dollar with the stable coin. Did they just not tell little Marco? He's out of the loop on the whole Tether coin plan.
Well, again, this is the dialectic play is very deep, and I think that's de-dollarization. PSYOP, I think, is how you actually create the breeding ground and the enabling environment for basically a private bank digital currency. As you make it that there's this arms race. Again, the foundation of DARPA was shit. Russia's in space. Now we're like. Shit, China's they're the yuan, the yuan, and we have to compete with them, and they're going to be doing all this other stuff, and I don't think they're really afraid of that. I don't really believe in multipolarity anymore. After the lockstep COVID response, basically worldwide, everybody had the exact same response. That might be a little controversial, but I mean, obviously there's always warring factions amongst the spoils, but I think the plan is the plan. And I think we're heading towards, all digital currency, digital ID, basically the internet becoming this, control grid more or less, where you have to show biometric ID systems for like everything, for money, for voting, for
Right.
driving a car, whatever it is. And so I think pushing this idea of we're losing the arms race, and we're rapidly de-dollarizing, I think is an important dialectic for the powers that be, to make it this sort of, that's what they're doing, frankly, with the Bitcoin reserve, is this idea that, well, if we don't do it, then China will buy Bitcoin,
Right.
and we'll
So
get
they're
screwed.
manufacturing consent. That's right.
Yeah, I would say so. And I might be wrong. I mean, maybe there is some element of, well, if we're going to completely go to this neutral reserve system on public blockchains, that maybe we do lose some ability to sanction. But the numbers don't really show that. I mean, I think the world is more dollarized than ever. And by, again, putting them on these private issuer, public rails, but of private issuers, again, Tether is going to grow a ton. And, they have the FBI on their rails, and they have seized millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars for law enforcement. Because again, money creation is innately a public-private partnership. So if they want to buy government debt to issue private tokens, they are sort of at the whim of the U.S. government to still be able to hold on to that debt and hold on to those treasuries and be able to operate, because the U.S. government can rug pull them of their treasuries, and sanction the issuers of digital money rather than the individuals using. They use the Tether, lackey, basically, to they put a a digital sanction. They freeze an asset, they freeze a wallet.
Well, yeah, I mean, the same way they used these social media platforms to censor people.
Exactly.
That way
100%.
they don't have to do it through the government.
Right. Like if those were truly public squares and they were upheld by the government, there would be so few ways that the First Amendment could be violated from a public entity. And money isn't exactly protected in the same way, but it is in a lot of ways. And so by pushing everything out onto these public blockchains so that they're surveillable without warrants, but then with private issued money, then they can use the customer restriction rights of private companies, but then they're backed by public debt. It's like this three-layered shit cake of the worst of all the worlds for us. And now we're stuck with, surveillable, programmable money by private issuers that can restrict and seize our money at any time. But then it's backed by public debt still. So they're still at the whim of the nation state. It's a disturbing paradigm, the stable coin paradigm. Bitcoin is obviously a little different. You can't stop a transaction on Bitcoin. But you could stop being able to go to an exchange. You can blacklist addresses if from a social agreement. Nothing on the protocol level, which is what is cool about it. But meaningfully, if you have money in Bitcoin and you can't go to an exchange and turn it into usable currency, if Bitcoin isn't spendable anywhere, then you'll have a much harder time actually like accessing that liquidity, even if it's worth millions of dollars. Actually, especially if it's worth more money, it's harder to liquidate. So there are ways that they can sort of use the on and off ramps, force everybody onto dollars, and still have some sort of control over the appreciation of Bitcoin in a way that, sort of limits the, because that's the one foil of this plan, is people like me and some of my friends that have been in it that have, maybe have the ability to have some funds to push back meaningfully. Well, can we actually do that? How does that play out? but theoretically a bunch of dissidents and libertarians and anti-state people that bought into the selling. There's this great Richard Sandor quote where he says, new financial products aren't bought, they're sold. And Bitcoin was sold. It was sold to us. And it was sold to us as this anti-state, anti-thing. And so there are a lot of us that are still in the movement that believe in those things. Well, now we have funding. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do? Can we meaningfully push back with, the little bit of the release valve we were able to catch on to before this thing rolls off a cliff and goes and becomes a foundation of empire?
All right. Let me ask you just one last, and it's probably a very dumb question, but it's the kind of dumb question that I think a lot of people who don't have expertise in this area have.
Okay.
What happens to all this digital currency if you have an EMP or a sunspot and all the power goes out? What happens?
Yeah, sure.
Is there a means to store that ownership information?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is where Bitcoin is more appropriate as a reserve asset than a lot of the sort of, maybe more Ethereum stablecoin based things, because Bitcoin actually, it's just a big ledger. It's just a big database of blocks strung together, and all the data in the blocks are just, this wallet spending to this wallet, and here's the change, that is the difference between the spend. And so Bitcoin isn't actually like, you don't actually hold the Bitcoin. Like when you have a little USB drive, hardware wallet or whatever that has your keys on it, you're not actually holding anything on that USB that is necessary to like the funds aren't on your key. All it is a signature that allows you to sign, that you can prove to the network that you have the ability to sign for the next ledger evolution, basically to say, hey, I have the rights to spend and satisfy the spend conditions of this ledger point, and now I can spend it in the next
whole
block.
Network is knocked out?
So if the whole network goes down and everything gets destroyed, the ledger stays at that point. And so nothing changes. So as long as you could literally write and a lot of us do, punch the keys into, it's basically this huge, large prime number. And that's what a Bitcoin key is, a private key. And so you can use mnemonic devices and certain things to reduce it down to like 12 words, but the entropy of the 12 words in the direct order makes this humongously big number that no one could ever guess. Like it's thermodynamically like borderline impossible to guess. So if you hold those 12 words, which are representing this ginormous prime number, then as soon as the network comes back online, you can just sign again. And you can just sign. So just because your hard drive gets fried or the network, everything holding up the network, if everything gets destroyed, but someone keeps a copy of the ledger in a Faraday bag, which a lot of us do, we can then take it out of the Faraday bag and plug it in, and then the network will get resynced very, very quickly. So it actually, much like the internet was designed as sort of this, in the event of a war, of a military action, how can we take these data packets and continue? Bitcoin was probably arguably designed specifically to decentralize its point of failure so that there's not one way you can. And now literally there are companies, we didn't talk about it, and it's a whole other 3-hour show, but Zappo, which were the people that actually built the custodial solution for the BlackRock ETF, and they sold their custody solution to Coinbase, which like houses the government's Bitcoin. They've actually put keys and things on the moon and in space, using satellites. They have these big Swiss bunkers where they have things underground that are like, in the event of a military blast or a nuclear blast, they would be able to preserve the network and their clients' keys. So there's a lot of like, nightmare proofing that's basically gone in, and the network was designed specifically to be able to withstand a shutdown. And then, with time, it could properly be synced up with absolutely no loss of funds at all. That's not necessarily true for other blockchains. Other blockchains use different consensus mechanisms, but proof of work consensus mechanisms.
Hawk you're screwed.
Octua, you're well, I don't know, screwed, but something.
Yeah.
Blown maybe. But yeah, Bitcoin was sort of designed, I think, probably intentionally to be able to withstand any sort of attack on the network with EMPs or anything like that.
All right. Keaton, you want to
all right. Yeah, let's go to, we just have 2 audience questions here. One from Noah Goop. So question for Mark, what do you see as far as the future of physical gold? If we move into a highly surveilled crypto system, could physical gold take over the anonymous transactions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason why gold, it just hit all-time high yesterday or 2 days ago or something like that. I think it absolutely could play a role. I mean, what we're going to see is debasement of the US dollar, which is advantageous for the US dollar system. We have $36 trillion of debt. Let's lower the price of dollars, the purchasing power of dollars, so it's easier for us to pay back the debt. It sort of makes sense. It's weird to think that we would debase our own money, but when we owe more money than we literally pay our government in a year, or rather our defense budget in a year, just to service the debt, it makes sense. We want the dollars as cheap as possible. So we're going to debase the dollars in some form, and we're going to do it in a way that allows us to retain net purchasing power over other world economies, but lower the price of the individual dollar. And that's something we've seen every day since 1971, right? So the interesting thing about gold and Bitcoin, the paradigm I think that's interesting to talk about, is the US government could solve their debt problem tomorrow if they simply, set the price of gold. I believe it's like every $4,000 an ounce of gold appreciates, the US makes $1 trillion, because that's how much gold holdings we have. Right. So if we wanted to inflate directly into gold instead of Bitcoin, we could do that, and we could just set the price of gold to be $40,000 an ounce, and we could pay off our debt tomorrow, no problem. But what are the second order effects of that? Every other country and all the people that hold gold and everyone else becomes filthy rich too.
Right.
So if we do it in a way where we inflate more specifically and outrageously into Bitcoin, which is predominantly held by the US, and one of the largest holders in the world is the US government, they have an asymmetric advantage, again, to have the appreciation go into Bitcoin specifically. I still think gold is going to appreciate immensely because there's going to be dollar debasement. Will it be as aggressive as Bitcoin? Probably not. But then again, it all could be a huge dialectic rug pull, and maybe that was the play all along. Maybe it's silver. I'm not really sure. If anyone that tells you, and yeah, right, anybody that tells you they know exactly what's going to happen is a fucking charlatan. I don't know. But I think that there's enough reason for the US to go into Bitcoin versus gold because of the advantage they have over other nation states. But I could not imagine gold not having a huge run as well. And I think that there are advantages to gold as a bearer asset that isn't digitally connected. Obviously, when you're talking the billions of dollars and stuff, it's harder to move around, and you need boats, and it becomes centralized because it's hard to scale. But there is something to be said about holding gold, and I think people probably should hold some gold. I'm not a financial advisor, but you should also probably be buying ammo too, at that point. So, but yeah, I think gold will probably appreciate quite a bit too.
All right, and then we got one last one: New York or Chicago pizza.
Oh man, well, I'm a New Englander, so I guess I would, my heart and my sports fandom and my father, I would probably want to say fuck New York, but
right,
I do really like New York pizza. Chicago pizza is great too. I like the deep dish; it's pretty nice. But like, if I had to me, the whole point. No, my I said the wrong thing. I talk shit on New York and the
Yeah,
thing goes out. If I had to have a slice of pizza, I would want a New York slice of pizza. I spent a lot of
Boom.
time. I spent a lot of time in New York, and I lived off of the fucking cheap slices because I had no money. And they got me through. So I'd have to probably say New York, but I
There
have
you
a
go.
deep affinity for deep dish. And I love the fucking Midwest. And I hate New York, but I also love it. So
Well,
it's
what part of New
complicated.
England are you from?
I grew up like 20 minutes outside of Boston.
Oh, okay.
But then
cool.
I spent like 12 years in the Bay Area. So
Nice. All right. So do you have your camera hooked up? Because I just want to get the closing for the video.
Oh yeah,
if
sure.
You,
Let me
if you can. Yeah, that'd be
yeah,
great.
I got you.
Yep. Give you a second on that.
Yeah, I had that deep dish when I was just out there for the convention. I mean, it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah.
Not as good.
But you guys are definitive New York boys, or
Yeah, I mean, I'm born and raised in the city. Keaton,
yeah.
Keaton,
Yeah.
Keaton grew up upstate, right?
Nice.
Upstate.
Yeah. Well,
Western?
Hudson Valley. Yeah.
Hudson Valley.
Now I'm
Oh hell
upstate.
yeah.
I mean, I lived in the
Nice.
city for about 7 years, but yeah. Yep.
Very cool. Yeah, I got a bunch of friends there. I was in the music scene in central Massachusetts, and I would just kind of do the circuits and go to Hartford, go to New York, play shows, go to Boston.
cool.
And I always had so much fun going to New York. I'm glad that I never actually like lived there. I spent like about a month there straight. It was probably the longest time. I liked it being a place to go like hang out.
You like
Right.
going and then you liked leaving.
And getting the
Yeah,
fuck out
exactly.
when I was done. Yeah.
All right, Mark Goodwin. Thanks for joining. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. You can find me on Twitter, MarkGoodW_IN. Mark Goodwin with an underscore between the W and the I. I spent a lot of time on there fighting the info war and hating myself and trying to go touch grass, but also writing, contributing to unlimitedhangout.com. My book, The Bitcoin Dollar, you can find at the Bitcoin -dollar.com, and I'm working on a new one that should be out somewhat soon. That's based on the Chain series that I wrote with Whitney Webb. Some alpha for you. We should have a book out pretty soon. So
Awesome.
that will do
All
it.
right.
Well, it's great to meet you, man. Thank you so much for joining. Appreciate it. Mark Goodwin.
Thank you very
everybody.
much, Mark.
Yeah, thanks,
right.
guys. Sorry, I know I talked a lot. Thanks a lot.
No, you did
No,
great.
no, you actually
the
now I
game.
can argue with the MMT people.
Yeah, there you go. All right, have a good one. Thank you, man. Appreciate
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Please clap.